Music. For tourists, and certainly many Berliners as well, the Weidendammer Bridge with the stylized imperial eagle is a top photo spot. And anyone who wants to learn more about the viaduct, which was officially called Weidendam Bridge until 1959 on Wikipedia, will find all sorts of trivial facts about Erich Kästner's Dot and Anton, the singer Wolf Biermann, or the young Theodor Fontane, who on the 8th here, December 8, 1845, got engaged to Emilie Rouanet Kume. But you also read the meaningless sentence that the Weidendammer Bridge was spared from explosions during World War II, so it could continue to be used without serious damage. But in the construct that calls itself an internet encyclopedia, this is at best a superficial view of history, since on the night of the 1st to the 2nd, May 1945, a bloodbath took place in front of, on, and behind this bridge. The photo shows the situation afterwards, across from the Admiral's Palast, located at Friedrichstrasse 101 to 102, where probably thousands lost their lives, while attempting to break through the Soviet encirclement to the north. Among these people was also a group of about 200 prominent men and women from the so-called Führer bunker. Among them, the Reich youth leader Arthur Axmann, the state secretary in the Ministry of Propaganda Dr. Werner Naumann, as well as the adjutant of Propaganda Minister Goebbels, SS Hauptsturmführer Günther Schwegermann, Hitler's flight captain, SS Gruppenführer, and Lieutenant General of the Waffen, SS Hans Bauernhofer, also the co-pilot who was killed during the breakout, SS Obersturmbannführer Georg Bötz, as well as the enigmatic, powerful head of the party chancellery of the NSDAP, Martin Bormann, together with Hitler's second personal physician, SS Standartenführer Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, just to name a few. It can be confirmed for Bormann and Stumpfegger that both, despite numerous rumors about their survival abroad, the failure of the breakout, and encounters with Soviet soldiers poisoned themselves with cyanide capsules. The remains of both were on the 7th. On December 7, 1972, they were found during underground cable work on Invalidenstrasse near the ruins of the Anhalter Bahnhof, and were clearly identified. Before I get to further details, here are some more explanations about it. The events took place between midnight and about 4 a.m. overnight, from the 1st to the 2nd May, in the center of Berlin, which was illuminated only by the fires caused by the intense street fighting. Therefore, it is understandable that the testimonies of people unfamiliar with the area may differ from each other during these chaotic hours, especially regarding times and locations, and the number of vehicles involved. It is also likely that some of the assumptions found in the literature, suggesting that the accounts might refer to experiences on different bridges, are probably not accurate, since of the bridges in question, only the Weidendam Bridge shown in green was intact, while the Ebertsbrücke and Montbijoubrücke to the east of it, as well as the pedestrian bridge Schlütersteg directly west next to Friedrichstrasse S-Bahn station, and also the Marschallbrücke and Kronprinzenbrücke, had been blown up or severely damaged. Fortunately, a group of amateur historians meticulously examined the few photos taken by Soviet photographers after the fighting and compiled a list. Which vehicles were used in the individual breakouts, which I'd like to share with you here. The first breakout took place shortly after midnight, when remnants of various shattered Wehrmacht units, supported only by a 2-centimeter quadruple anti-aircraft gun, mounted on a Sonder Kfz 7/1 half-track, advanced along both sides of Friedrichstrasse. While the anti-aircraft gun made it through, the soldiers were pinned down by Soviet fire after about 150 meters. 15 minutes later, the already mentioned prominent group around Bormann tried it, supported by soldiers of the Leibstandarte. To do this, they had gathered at the first tank barrier at the Weidendammer Bridge, led by a Panzer VI Tiger tank, followed by 2 medium-armored personnel carriers of the Sonder KFC 251 type. After the tanks, with concentrated fire, had shot up the second tank barrier, assembled from broken-down vehicles, 300 meters north of the bridge, they started to move out. However, the first armored personnel carrier was immediately destroyed, and the infantry following it was now pinned down under fire. At least the other tanks managed to break through, but then the Tiger also went up in flames after being hit, which meant the second breakout attempt had failed. The third took place at around 1 o'clock. Again, a large number of soldiers and civilians had gathered at the bridge, who then charged forward with the support of some wildly firing armored personnel carriers from Reconnaissance Battalion 11 of the SS Division Nordland. In doing so, however, they showed no regard and drove over everything in their way, including the wounded or fallen. But when the first armored personnel carrier was stopped by a hit, all the following vehicles piled up behind it. As a result, the Soviet soldiers now fired from a house behind the bridge and from the direction of the Friedrichstrasse-Siegelstrasse intersection. They also set the other APCs and the trucks loaded with ammunition on fire with artillery and Panzerfaust fire, after which the third attempt had also failed. Around 2 o'clock, the fourth attempt took place. This time it was carried out by an agitated crowd without any military order, only under the motto, "Every man for himself." Meanwhile, on the other side of the bridge and at the following intersections, all defensive weapons were manned by Soviet soldiers, who now targeted the civilians, and soldiers wandering around blindly with artillery and mortar fire. However, in the glow from the armored personnel carriers set ablaze during the third breakout, a Sturmgeschütz 3 and a tractor with a heavy howitzer managed to get through. Most likely, these belonged to the People's Artillery Corps 408, which was equipped with captured Soviet guns of 15.2 caliber, as well as a number of supply vehicles that were brought in front of the bridge, from where the field howitzer shot up the corner building. However, the front-rear wall collapsed in such a way that it now blocked the street, which meant that this attempt had also failed. The last attempt began after 4 a.m., while it was still dark. For this, the last available vehicles of the Nordland Division had been used. Hardly had they crossed the bridge covered with dead bodies, with a chaotic jumble of people in uniform and civilians behind them, when they turned left into Schiffbauerdamm and broke through the tank barrier there. Then this panic-stricken advancing column, having lost their armored vehicles, reached an S-Bahn bridge in an alley near the Charité Hospital, where the column scattered without success, and those who hadn't fallen ended up in Soviet captivity. But how did this catastrophe even happen, when it was clear to everyone that the total surrender of the Wehrmacht was only a matter of days? Here is the background to this. After the expected major offensive of the Red Army, called the Vistula-Oder Operation, broke out on January 12th along a front of 1,200 kilometers. It was now clear even to the highest military leadership that this steamroller could no longer be stopped before reaching the borders of Germany. As a result, on February 1, 1945, the so-called Case Clausewitz was triggered, with measures intended to turn Berlin into a fortress. In reality, however, almost nothing had been prepared. In addition, the political instrument of divide and rule introduced in the Third Reich had also contributed to this. That due to this division of command authority between politics and the Wehrmacht, there were now repeated changes among the military commanders in Military District 3 Berlin. Following the death of General of the Infantry Joachim von Kortzfleisch in the Sauerland on April 20, 1945. On February 2, 1945, Lieutenant General Bruno Ritter von Hauenschild took over, who was in turn succeeded by Lieutenant General Helmut Reimann on March 6. To this leadership chaos was added the fact that both Hitler in the so-called Führerbunker, the high command of the Wehrmacht, located in the Maybach II bunker complex in Wunsdorf near Zossen, and the Reich Defense Commissioner Joseph Goebbels were constantly overruling General Reimann. When Reimann opposed this leadership confusion, his dismissal from above was set for the 14th. His dismissal had been ordered for March 14, but his designated successor, General of Engineers Walter Kunze, essentially refused the hopeless assignment, so on the 22nd. On April 22, Minister Goebbels independently appointed Infantry Colonel Ernst Käther as Berlin's battle commander, for which he was promoted by Hitler to Lieutenant General for special duties. Käther stayed in this position until midday on the 24th. April, as commander of the Berlin defense area, or he was still in this position on the evening of April 22, 1945, he was dismissed for incompetence. In any case, Hitler then promoted the then 30-year-old infantry lieutenant Colonel Erich Barenfänger to Major General, skipping the rank of colonel, and appointed him as the battle commander of Berlin, until he then, on the 24th, was replaced by Lieutenant General Weidling, who once again saw it only as the business of the party bigwigs and felt like he was in a madhouse. In any case, by April 25th, Käther was again colonel for special duties on the staff of the Berlin Defense District, while the holder of the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves and swords, the convinced National Socialist Barenfänger, now again commander of Sections A and B, also attempted a breakout. When that failed, he took his own life on the 2nd in the Schultheiss Brewery, which was being used as the command post for Defense Sector H. On May 2, 1945, together with his wife Margot and his brother-in-law Lieutenant Armin Rücker, he committed suicide. Meanwhile, on April 16, 1945, with the battle at the Seelow Heights, the Battle of Berlin had begun, with up to 10 times the strength on the two Soviet army fronts. Altogether, there were nearly 2 million soldiers, 5,000 tanks, 25,000 guns and mortars, as well as 5,500 aircraft. From their bridgehead on both sides of Kustrin, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's armies and, from the Guben area, Marshal Ivan Konev's armies had set out to launch a pincer attack on Berlin. And right on time for Hitler's birthday, on April 20th, the Soviet troops had completed their encirclement of Berlin. Only the 56th, led by Lieutenant General Weidling, and used as an Army Group reserve, Panzer Corps had still managed to hold out in the southeast of Berlin. It was a corps in the 9th Army led by General of the Infantry Theodor Busse in Army Group Vistula. Here is Busse on March 3, 1945, during a situation briefing with Hitler on the Oder. When Weidling then intended with his from the 9th. When Weidling intended to break through to the south with his tank corps, which had been separated from the 9th Army, and to reconnect with the army near Königs Wusterhausen in order to cover its southern flank as well, he received on the 23rd. On April 23rd, around 4 p.m., Hitler's order arrived that the 56th Panzer Corps should take over the defense of Berlin. Weidling then took office on the morning of the 24th, and, since the 18th March, as Chief of Staff of the Berlin Defense Area, Colonel in the General Staff Hans Refior initially formed the defense sectors A to H. And since practically nothing had been prepared for the defense of the city of Berlin, in reality, both of them were left empty-handed. Regardless of that, both had resigned themselves to the inevitable and divided up the units available to them. It was purely by chance, that among the troop units there were also remnants of foreign Waffen-SS formations. Because these had by no means been deliberately deployed in Berlin as European volunteers against Bolshevism, but had simply had the misfortune of being available. Here, Weidling's defense forces. The newly formed Müncheberg Panzer Division in the spring of 1945 under the command of Major General of the Reserve Werner Mummert, who died under unclear circumstances in Soviet captivity on January 28, 1950, at the age of 52. After suffering heavy losses west of the Oder, the Müncheberg Division arrived in Berlin with only half of its intended strength and about 20 tanks. The 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, which was also only formed in the spring of 1945 under the command of Josef Rauch, who was promoted to Major General on April 20. This division was still relatively intact and was immediately deployed as an emergency reserve. The 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, also on the 20th April, promoted to Major General Georg Scholze, which, due to very heavy losses at the Oder, had only very little combat strength left. After the division was encircled in Berlin, Wannsee on April 23, Scholze committed suicide. The 9th, which had only been formed a week earlier under Colonel Harry Hermann, Paratrooper Division, which had arrived in Berlin with only remnants and without heavy weapons due to the previous heavy retreat battles at the Oder, and was therefore only partially operational. The 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, under the command of Brigadeführer and Major General of the Waffen-SS Joachim Ziegler, who fell in Berlin on May 2nd, and who is the subject of this video. This division, composed of Scandinavian and Dutch volunteers, as well as some conscripted ethnic Germans from the Balkans and Germans from the Reich, was still considered a strong combat unit. However, this did not change the fact that, for example, its infantry regiments 23 Nord and 24 Denmark each had only 2 battalions, each the size of a weak company. The artillery available was the People's Artillery Corps 408, led by Colonel of the Reserve Günther Adam, with 6 battalions. The 2 heavy ones were equipped with captured Soviet guns of 15.2 cm caliber, which ran out of ammunition after a short period of combat activity. Additionally, there was the depleted Waffen Fusilier Battalion of the SS-15 of the 15th Waffen Grenadier Division, SS Latvian No. 1 and about 100 soldiers of the Waffen Grenadier Regiment, 57 of the 33rd Waffen Grenadiers of the Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne, 1st French. In addition, on April 20, the so-called Clausewitz Levy, mobilized under the so-called Operation Clausewitz, joined in, consisting of makeshift units of about 45,000 soldiers from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, 40,000 Volkssturm militiamen, 3,500 members of the Hitler Youth, as well as members of the Reich Labor Service and the Paramilitary Construction Unit Organization, TAUT. Finally, one on the late evening of the 25th, 15. In April, very young naval cadets of the Kriegsmarine brought in with Ju-52s and quartered in the cellars of the Foreign Office, with a strength of 2 companies under Lieutenant Commander Franz Kuhlmann of the Reserve, and the first one, Anti-Aircraft Division under Major General Otto Sudau, with the North and South Flak Groups. At this time, Hitler and his closest staff in the Führerbunker under the new Reich Chancellery were still hoping for the liberation of the Reich capital from the outside, especially since from the 21st to the 29th April, the so-called Combat Bulletin for the defenders of the Reich capital was only published 7 times. Panzerbears spread one perseverance slogan after another, although it is still not exactly known who was behind it. On April 23rd, this strange order had also been printed. At first, Hitler's hope was based on the 12th Army led by General of the Armored Troops, Walter Wenck. This army had actually advanced as far as the outskirts of Potsdam, but then, realizing the futility of the impossible relief of Berlin, they turned northwest, crossed the Elbe at Tangermunde, and surrendered to the U.S. Army. After his disappointment over the army led by Wenck not arriving, Hitler now hoped that the liberation of Berlin would come from the north, by the remnants of Army Group Vistula, led by Colonel General Gotthard Heinrizi. But just like Wenck, Heinrizi also recognized the futility of the relief order and refused it, after which, on the 29th April, he was relieved of his post at his own request and was to be replaced by Colonel General Kurt Student, who, however, never actually took office due to the chaotic situation. When Hitler then realized that the capture of Berlin by the Soviet army was inevitable, he had, on the night of the 29th April, he first married his companion Eva Braun, and then committed suicide with her on the 30th. After that, as if a spell had been lifted from both soldiers and civilians, it was decided, according to the plan already available on the 28th April, by General Weitling and the Chief of Staff of his 56th, which had already been submitted. Panzer Corps, Colonel Theodor von Duffing, had drawn up a plan to break out, among other routes, over the Weidendammer Bridge to the north. However, the breakout to the north had taken place against Weitling's wishes, as he wanted to abandon Berlin and have all units link up with Army Group Vistula, which was retreating to the west. However, he had not been able to prevail against SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke, who had been personally appointed by Hitler as commander of the defense forces of the government district. In addition to all this, Colonel Dreyfus later wrote in his Berlin diary that the attempt to break out in small groups, for example, was doomed to fail from the start. The same applied to the breakout with combined combat groups. In this situation, according to Dreyfus, every attempt only meant a useless sacrifice of our soldiers, an unnecessary risk to human lives. The failed breakout attempts by the Reich Chancellery garrison over the Weidendammer Bridge to the north and by parts of the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, which attempted to break out to the west via Spandau, are the late proof of Weitling's correct assessment of the situation. Weitling saw very clearly that in this situation, the only thing that mattered was to preserve the lives of the soldiers entrusted to him and to end the suffering and torment of the Berlin population as quickly as possible. To achieve that, there was only one thing left: surrender. But since the prominent figures in the Führer bunker could imagine what would happen to them as those responsible in Soviet captivity, they had therefore decided to attempt an escape. However, these people were anything but great warriors, because most of them were uniformed administrative officers who were allowed to move little flags back and forth on the situation maps or performed other services for Hitler. Since these people were also aware that they were not heavily armed breakout warriors, they preferred to sneak out quietly. When it came to slipping away, SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, who was responsible for the defense of the government district, was particularly successful. Together with the deposed commander of the 11th SS Division Nordland, SS Brigade Führer Ziegler, and his successor, SS Brigade Führer Dr. Gustav Krukenberg, they used the so-called Schlütersteg instead of the Weidendamm Bridge during the night, undisturbed by enemy fire, to get to the other side of the Spree at Schiffbauerdamm. What is remarkable is that Mohnke, who had been informed in time by someone, had told only a few people before the breakout to absolutely avoid both Friedrichstrasse and the Weidendamm Bridge. But he had deliberately withheld this knowledge from the other troops, which led to the extraordinarily high number of deaths on the bridge and on Friedrichstrasse. There are a number of reports made after the war by participants about the unimaginable events of that night, which vividly describe the eerie atmosphere. In 1965, the aforementioned Hitler youth leader Arthur Axmann reported, "Around 10 p.m. we left the bunker of the Reich Chancellery. When we reached Friedrichstrasse, it suddenly became lively. Soldiers, civilians, women, ambulances, assault guns, everything was moving north, trying to cross the Spree. In front of the wide tank barrier north of the Weidendammer Bridge, everything was backed up. The Russians were sitting on both sides of the street across the Spree in the ruins and houses, firing continuously with every weapon they had. A German quadruple anti-aircraft gun was pouring fire into the enemy-occupied houses, while a German assault gun was weaving through the tank barrier in a slalom. It was brought to a halt under Russian fire. Some men from our combat group were lost." Hans Bauer, Hitler's chief pilot, wrote in his book in 1974, "Since everything around Gendarmenmarkt was burning, we ran back to Friedrichstrasse and from there towards Weidendammer Bridge. The Russians knew exactly that everything trying to escape from Berlin had to cross this bridge, so they focused their fire mainly on this point. That was also the reason for the countless dead and wounded at this spot." The journalist and head of the radio department of the Ministry of Propaganda, Hans Fritzsche, reported in 1970. Around midnight, the first participants of the breakout attempt returned. One of them, the so-called Reich Dramaturge in the Ministry of Propaganda, Rainer Schlösser, described a futile attempt, and then he spoke of a blind assault at Friedrichstrasse station, which led to a bloodbath at the Weidendammer Bridge. Schlösser was sentenced to death by a Soviet military tribunal on June 30, 1945, for alleged war crimes and was shot on August 9. Heinz Herring, who served as a war correspondent and was the editor-in-chief of the weekly newspaper of the Churmark Regional Farmers Association, reported in 1985, "In front of Friedrichstrasse station, it has become light by now, a bewildered crowd. Although there are many high-ranking officers among them, none of them takes command. This situation makes me uneasy." In 1992, the commander of the 3rd Company of the 11th Armored Engineer Battalion reported, SS Division Nordland Hans Henseler. "The streets are crowded with people and vehicles, packed with all their belongings, children, and everything they own. Only with great effort do we reach a tank barrier behind the Weidendammer Bridge on Friedrichstrasse, heading toward Stettiner Bahnhof. We are part of the 3rd wave, and right now a strong group of at least 600 to 800 men is forming again to make another attempt. A chaos without equal, indescribable. An insane confusion begins. Anyone who falls gets trampled. I lack the words to describe this scene. We stop behind the tank barrier. No one can get through with an order anymore. No one obeys anymore. Again, a strong group forms with us to follow these men. You literally have to step over the dead, and the blood is running in the street. It is indescribable." Hitler's longtime driver from 1932 to 1945, SS Obersturmbannführer, equivalent to Lieutenant Colonel Erich Kempka, was also there during the breakout. In his book published in 1951, you can read, "A shocking sight met our eyes, soldiers exhausted to the point of death, wounded with no care at all, and refugees were lying along the walls, on the platforms, and on the stairs. Most of them had given up any hope of a successful escape and were completely apathetic." The driver of one of the Tiger tanks from the Nordland Division, under the command of Panzer Commander Hess, Hans Kuppen, wrote in a letter, "Soldiers advanced on the bridge. On the north side, heavy enemy fire began. Flames and detonations lit up the night. Trucks, packed with soldiers and civilians, tried to cross the bridge. Panic broke out. I said to my comrade Schmidt, 'This is going to be a fiasco.' Siegfried Lorenz from the SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, 11 of the Nordland Division. At night, we assembled to break out over the Weidendammer Bridge to the northeast. Everything that can still move is ready. Up front is my armored personnel carrier with machine gun and tank cannon. Behind me is an armored personnel carrier from the 3rd Company, then the rest of the APCs and a field kitchen. I cross the bridge. In front of us is a tank barrier. Everything comes to a halt. The Russian defensive fire grows stronger and stronger. Tank shelling begins. They all fell, as did many hundreds of other brave soldiers who sought this route to avoid Russian captivity, which at that time meant certain death. The State Secretary in the Ministry of Propaganda, the aforementioned Dr. Werner Naumann, wrote in a memorandum, "As we continued our march, we unexpectedly encountered significant enemy resistance at the Ziegelstrasse intersection. Only a few individuals, but not the group, managed to cross Ziegelstrasse. There were many heavy losses at this intersection. Unterscharführer, also known as Unterbezieher Peter Ruhm, radio squad leader of an 80-watt radio squad in the Signal Company of the Signals Battalion 11 of the Nordland Division, wrote in 1993, "At dawn, 6 armored personnel carriers lined up behind the tank barrier to attempt another breakthrough. I got into the 6th vehicle. The convoy took off at full speed. Then there was a big bang, and the 5 vehicles in front of us were knocked out. In front of the tank barrier, many fallen comrades were now lying, and behind the barrier there were numerous officers, including high-ranking ones. I approached a group of high-ranking officers and asked, 'What's going on, gentlemen? Is anyone here still taking the initiative for the soldiers up front? Or are you sending them home?' The gentleman just turned around in silence and walked a few steps away. It was expressed even more clearly in 1984 in a tape-recorded interview by the commander of an assault gun, Hans Rave, whose assault gun was subordinated to the assault gun battle group from March to the Tank Regiment 11. Hermann von Salza under Obersturmbannführer Paul Albers Kausch from the Nordland Division. I myself have very bad memories of Berlin, especially regarding our officers. They totally failed. No clear orders were given. Why didn't they give all the tanks and assault guns the order to fire at the houses with the machine gun nests at the same time, to flatten them? Then there wouldn't have been so many losses. And there were enormous losses. I have never seen so many dead and wounded on our side, not during the whole war. And I was there since 1940. During the breakthrough, no infantryman got through. The Wehrmacht colonel, senior medical officer, and SS senior medical officer Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk wrote in the book I Saw Berlin Die that he, together with the Monke group, safely reached Schiffbauer Damm via the Schlütersteg. But then, on Chausseestrasse, they became aware of the horror around them. The ground shook, the air trembled, clouds of powder smoke spread out and enveloped us. But to our relief, the costly fireworks were not meant for us. It was clearly concentrated, as far as one could tell, on Friedrichstrasse, the banks of the Spree, and the Weidendammer Bridge. While we wandered around the periphery of the battle, a drama was unfolding at the Weidendammer Bridge, and piles of corpses were mounting up. SS Hauptsturmführer, equivalent to Captain, Rudolf Ternede, commander of the SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 24 Denmark in the Nordland Division, who was supposed to break through the encirclement with the remnants of his regiment and the Norge Regiment at 11 p.m. over the Weidendammer Bridge, wrote in a letter, "When I arrived at the Weidendammer Bridge with my staff, the whole inferno finally became clear. The enemy was firing with everything they had. The HJ leader Axmann offers 500 boys from his Hitler Youth for the breakout. I refuse this offer and suggest sending the boys home to their parents. After consulting with my adjutant and orderly officer, I decided to dissolve the remaining parts of the Norge and Denmark regiments and release them from their military obligations. I recommended breaking through on their own to get home. Horrible, unforgettable scenes took place in the area of the Weidendammer Bridge. Word had apparently gotten around that a still intact disciplined unit of the Waffen-SS wanted to break out here. That's why everyone crowded into this confined space. Luftwaffe, Army, Organization Tot, Nazi Party bigwigs, Hitler Youth, civilians, all mixed together. And the adjutant of the 2nd, SS Brigadeführer Joachim Ziegler, who fell on May 2nd, and his adjutant, Hauptsturmführer of the Reserve Joachim Tiburtius, wrote in 1953. 50. The whole area was brightly lit by the fire of the burning city. The Russians kept us under constant fire from their mortars and cannons of various calibers. Warplanes also flew over the area and dropped their bombs at irregular intervals. Every man was drunk, as far as I could see. In a sober state, no one could have endured this constant threat of death. All we had left to keep fighting were 2 Tigers and 3 or 4 armored personnel carriers. As soon as the tanks came under fire, they rolled away and left us defenseless. With the testimony of Tiburtius, I conclude the accounts of eyewitnesses and participants in these dramatic events on the Weidendammer Bridge. It was their misfortune that it wasn't destroyed, because otherwise the breakouts wouldn't have happened, and a large number, reaching into the thousands, of German and Soviet people would have stayed alive. I dedicate this video to these people, since you can't find anything about it at the Weidendammer Bridge itself, and even elsewhere in Berlin, you have to search hard for testimonies about similar events. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Feel free to recommend the video to others as well. And I would also like to remind you to check out the Patreon program, which would really help the channel. I wish you a great time and look forward to seeing you next time. Yours, Michael Hines.